On January 27, 1945, Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz. What they found was almost impossible to comprehend. Thousands of prisoners were still alive, many of them starving, sick, and barely able to walk. Among the survivors were children who had been subjected to some of the most horrific medical experiments carried out inside the camp. But one of the doctors responsible was already gone. His name was Josef Mengele. He had spent nearly 2 years at Auschwitz, where he participated in prisoner selections and conducted brutal experiments, particularly on twins and children. By the end of the war, Mengele had become one of the most notorious Nazi doctors in Europe. But unlike many other major Nazi criminals, he would not stand trial. He would not spend his final years in prison. He would not even live under his real name. Instead, Josef Mengele would disappear into South America and spend decades hiding in plain sight. 4 years, investigators searched for him. Governments issued warrants. Nazi hunters tracked leads across continents. And yet Mengele continued to live. In Argentina, then Paraguay, then Brazil. He even managed to obtain citizenship under another name. And when he finally died in 1979, the world still did not know for certain where he was. It would take another 6 years to prove that the man who had escaped justice was finally dead. But how did one of the world's most wanted Nazi criminals disappear so completely? And how did he remain free for 34 years? To understand that story, we first have to understand the man who became known as the Angel of Death. The making of Josef Mengele. Josef Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in the Bavarian town of Günzburg, Germany. His childhood was not one of poverty. His father, Karl Mengele, was a successful manufacturer of agricultural machinery, and the family was financially comfortable. Mengele was intelligent and ambitious. He studied medicine and physical anthropology at German universities, eventually earning a doctorate in physical anthropology from the University of Munich in 1935. He later passed his medical examinations and began working at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt. There, he worked under Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, a prominent geneticist who specialized in research involving twins. This relationship would become extremely important, because Mengele's interest in twins did not begin at Auschwitz. It existed before the war. The problem was that Nazi ideology transformed scientific research into something far more dangerous. The Nazis believed that humanity could be divided into supposedly superior and inferior races. Jewish people, Roma, people with disabilities, and others were portrayed as biological threats to Germany. Medicine was increasingly placed in the service of this ideology. And Mengele embraced it. In 1938, he completed another doctorate. He also joined the Nazi Party and later the SS. When Germany went to war, Mengele served in the military and was decorated for his service. But in 1943, his career took him somewhere that would make his name infamous around the world. Auschwitz. On May 30, 1943, Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not simply a concentration camp. It was also a major killing center where Jews deported from across German-occupied Europe were murdered on a massive scale. When trains arrived, prisoners were subjected to selections. Some were chosen for forced labor. Others were sent directly to the gas chambers. Children, elderly people, and those considered unable to work were particularly vulnerable. Mengele became one of the SS physicians responsible for these selections. He would stand near the arrival ramps and decide, together with other SS personnel, who would live temporarily and who would be sent toward death. Survivors remembered his presence. He was not necessarily the highest-ranking doctor at Auschwitz. He wasn't the only physician performing selections. But he became one of the most recognizable. Part of the reason was his obsession with finding people who could be used in his research. Especially twins. When transports arrived, Mengele often searched among the prisoners for twins. Children who were otherwise destined for death could suddenly be separated from their families and taken to special barracks. To them, Mengele could sometimes appear strangely friendly. He might smile. He might give children sweets. He could behave almost like a reassuring doctor. But this apparent kindness concealed something horrifying. The children were not being protected. They were being preserved as research subjects. Mengele wanted to measure them, photograph them, examine them, draw blood from them, and perform medical procedures on them. His research was supposedly designed to investigate heredity and racial biology. But much of it was based on Nazi racial ideology and pseudoscience. The prisoners had no choice. There was no informed consent. There was no medical ethics. There was no possibility of refusing. And when Mengele's researchers were finished with some of the twins, they were murdered so that their bodies could be examined. The Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum documents experiments involving twins and people with physical abnormalities, including examinations followed by killings and comparative autopsies. For Mengele, human beings had been reduced to experimental material, and children were among his primary victims. The Angel of Death. The nickname Angel of Death became associated with Mengele after the war. It captured the terror many prisoners felt when they saw him. But there is an important distinction. Mengele was not some completely irrational madman acting independently. He was a trained physician. He had studied at universities. He had worked alongside established scientists. His crimes were carried out inside a larger Nazi system that had transformed medicine into an instrument of racial persecution and mass murder. That makes his story even more disturbing. He wasn't ignorant of medicine. He was a doctor who deliberately used his education inside a system that had stripped certain human beings of their basic rights. At Auschwitz, Mengele also took an interest in people with physical abnormalities, including dwarfs and people with unusual eye coloration. He conducted research on Roma prisoners and participated in selections involving the camp's Roma population. In August 1944, when the Roma family camp at Auschwitz was liquidated, Mengele participated in the selection process that sent thousands of Roma prisoners to the gas chambers. His work was not legitimate science. It was a combination of racial ideology, coercion, abuse, and murder. And then, in January 1945, the Soviet army approached. The SS began evacuating Auschwitz. Mengele fled. The war ends, but Mengele disappears. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. Berlin fell. Hitler was dead. The war in Europe was over. And the Allies began searching for Nazi war criminals. Some were captured almost immediately. Others were identified through documents and testimony. Major figures were eventually placed on trial at Nuremberg and in subsequent proceedings. But Mengele was different. He had disappeared. During the final months of the war, records and evidence relating to individual perpetrators were scattered, destroyed, or left behind. Mengele had another advantage. At first, the Allies did not realize exactly where he was. And unlike some of the most famous Nazi leaders, he was not immediately recognized as one of the most important targets. He was simply one SS doctor among many. That mistake would give him time. After the war, Mengele was briefly held by American forces. But he was released because his identity had not been established. That decision would have enormous consequences. Mengele returned to hiding. For a while, he remained in Germany, using false papers and avoiding attention. But the situation was becoming more dangerous. Nazi hunters were beginning to identify former SS personnel. Investigators were collecting testimony from survivors. And the Allies were increasingly determined to locate people responsible for atrocities. Mengele realized he could not remain in Germany forever. He needed a new identity. And he needed somewhere else to go. The escape to Argentina. In 1949, Mengele left Europe. With financial assistance from his family, he traveled to Argentina under a false name. He became Helmut Greger. Argentina had already become a destination for some Europeans fleeing the aftermath of World War II. Among those who arrived were people connected to the Nazi regime. Mengele settled into his new life. And remarkably, he began to feel safe. He was no longer the SS doctor at Auschwitz. He was a man with a different name, a different country, a different identity. For several years, it worked. He lived in Argentina and established contacts. He even became confident enough to seek Argentine citizenship. By 1956, he obtained citizenship under the name Josef Mengele. The fugitive was becoming comfortable. Perhaps too comfortable. Because investigators were still searching. And eventually, the net began closing around him. In 1959, West German prosecutors learned that Mengele was in Argentina and sought his arrest. Mengele realized that his hiding place was no longer secure. So he fled again. This time, he went to Paraguay. He obtained Paraguayan citizenship. For a moment, it looked like he had escaped once more. But then something happened that changed everything. The capture of Eichmann. In May 1960, Israeli intelligence agents captured another notorious Nazi fugitive, Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann had been living in Argentina under a false identity. Israeli agents secretly abducted him and transported him to Israel, where he would stand trial. The news shocked the world. For Mengele, it was terrifying. If Israeli intelligence could find Eichmann in Argentina, they could find him too. And Mengele reportedly understood the danger. He disappeared again. This time, he went to Brazil. He would never return to Europe. He would never face trial. And for the next 19 years, he would live under assumed identities in Brazil. The man who vanished. Mengele's escape is often imagined as if he lived alone in a hidden jungle cabin. The reality was more complicated. He relied heavily on a network of people. His family in Germany continued to provide financial support. He had contacts in South America. He moved between locations. He used false names. And he avoided situations that could expose him. Eventually, he settled near São Paulo. There, he lived under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. To the outside world, Josef Mengele had disappeared. But he hadn't. He was alive. He was living in Brazil. And investigators were still looking for him. The United States, West Germany, Israel, and Nazi hunters continued to pursue leads. But every time investigators seemed to get closer, Mengele moved or disappeared behind another layer of secrecy. One of the most extraordinary aspects of his escape was that he did not need to completely disappear from civilization. He simply needed to disappear from the people searching for him. He could live quietly, avoid publicity, use another name, and depend on people willing to help him. Meanwhile, his victims were growing older. Survivors were telling their stories. The crimes at Auschwitz were becoming increasingly documented. And Mengele's name became synonymous with Nazi medical crimes. But there was still no courtroom. No verdict. No sentence. The hunt for Mengele. During the 1960s and 1970s, the search for Mengele continued. Nazi hunters investigated reports of sightings. Some were false. Others were impossible to verify. Rumors placed him in different countries. He became almost mythical. There were stories that he was living in Paraguay. Stories that he was hiding in Argentina. Stories that he was somewhere deep in Brazil. The uncertainty itself helped him. Every false lead consumed time. Every rumor created another possibility. And every year that passed made Mengele harder to find. But investigators never completely stopped. In Germany, prosecutors continued examining evidence. In Israel, Nazi hunters remained interested in his whereabouts. And the Simon Wiesenthal Center and other investigators kept the search alive. Mengele had escaped the immediate post-war reckoning. But he had not escaped history. The last day. By the late 1970s, Mengele was an old man. He was living near São Paulo. He was no longer the young SS doctor who had walked through Auschwitz. He was a fugitive in his 60s. And then, on February 7, 1979, something unexpected happened. Mengele went swimming at a resort near Bertioga, Brazil. While in the water, he suffered a stroke. He drowned. He was buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. And for the moment, the world did not know that Josef Mengele was dead. This is where his story becomes almost unbelievable. Because the man investigators had spent decades hunting had died without being captured. He had not been arrested. He had not been tried. He had not been sentenced. He had simply died. And his grave carried someone else's name. The world discovers the truth. For years, Mengele's death remained uncertain. Then, in 1985, the governments of West Germany, Israel, and the United States cooperated in a renewed effort to determine what had happened to him. German police discovered evidence indicating that Mengele had died and had been buried near São Paulo. Brazilian authorities located the grave. In June 1985, his remains were exhumed. Forensic specialists examined the body. Eventually, investigators concluded that the remains belonged to Josef Mengele. But the identification was not completely settled until later. In 1992, DNA testing confirmed it. The man known as Wolfgang Gerhard had been Josef Mengele. The fugitive was dead. And the truth was finally established. He had escaped justice for 34 years. Why was Mengele never caught? So how did one of the most wanted Nazi criminals manage to remain free for so long? There wasn't one simple answer. It was a combination of circumstances. First, Mengele benefited from the chaos immediately after the war. His identity was not recognized quickly enough. Second, he had money. His family helped support him. Third, he had networks. He wasn't completely alone. He had people who could help him obtain documents, find places to stay, and move between countries. Fourth, he repeatedly changed his identity and location. And finally, he benefited from time. Every year he remained free made his trail colder. By the time investigators had a clear picture of his movements, Mengele was already thousands of miles away. And there was another factor. The pursuit of Nazi criminals was not always consistent. In the years after World War II, the world was entering a new conflict, the Cold War. The priorities of governments changed. Former Nazis sometimes became useful to intelligence agencies or political causes. The pursuit of every war criminal was not equally aggressive. Mengele benefited from the gaps. But he never truly disappeared. The legacy of Mengele. There is something important about Josef Mengele's story that goes beyond the fact that he escaped. His crimes demonstrate how dangerous science can become when it is stripped of ethics and placed under an ideology that denies the humanity of certain people. Mengele was not simply experimenting because he was curious. His research was embedded in Nazi racial ideology. The people he experimented on were not volunteers. They were prisoners. Many were children. And many died. The experiments were not legitimate medical research. They were crimes. The Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum both emphasize the connection between Mengele's experiments and Nazi racial ideology and pseudoscience. That distinction matters. Because sometimes Mengele is portrayed as a mysterious, mad scientist. But that description can actually make his story less frightening. He wasn't a fictional monster. He was a real doctor who operated inside a real institution, surrounded by other educated professionals. His crimes were possible because an entire system had decided that some human beings could be treated as less than human. That is the real horror of Josef Mengele. The files are still opening. And even decades after his death, Mengele's story has not completely disappeared. In May 2026, Switzerland's Federal Intelligence Service announced that it would allow access to its file on Josef Mengele after a review determined that the records fell under a framework favoring broader archival access. That means that even now, historians continue examining the networks and circumstances surrounding one of the world's most notorious fugitives. New documents may not change the basic facts of Mengele's life, but they can help answer an important question. How did someone responsible for such horrific crimes manage to remain free for so long? The man who escaped. Josef Mengele spent less than 2 years at Auschwitz. But the consequences of what he did there lasted for the rest of his victims' lives. He became one of the most recognizable names associated with Nazi medical crimes. And yet, unlike many of the people who occupied the highest levels of the Nazi regime, he never stood before an international court. He never heard a judge read a sentence against him. He never spent a single day in prison for the crimes he committed at Auschwitz. Instead, he lived under false names. He moved across continents. He depended on family and sympathizers. And he died peacefully enough to leave investigators wondering for years whether they had finally found him. For 34 years, Josef Mengele escaped the justice that had caught so many others. But he could not escape history. His name remained. The testimonies of survivors remained. The records remained. The photographs remained. And eventually, even the grave beneath a false name could not hide the truth. Josef Mengele wanted to disappear. He succeeded in hiding from the world for decades. But he never disappeared from the history of Auschwitz. And perhaps that is the final irony of his story. He spent his entire life after the war trying to erase his identity. Yet today, his real name is remembered not because he escaped justice, but because the world refused to forget what he had done. Josef Mengele escaped the courtroom. He escaped prison. He escaped across 3 countries. But he never escaped history.